Hi, it's Stephen Seiler here. On the 18th of July, I'm really looking forward to presenting my 3-hour live stream hosted by the Physical Performance Show, Sustainable Training for Attainable Endurance Goals. Get your tickets today, and I will see you online.
We are thrilled to be hosting acclaimed sports scientist Dr. Stephen Seiler, forefather of polarized training, on an upcoming 3-hour live stream event in July. Dr. Seiler, during this live stream, will cover 4 key areas around sustainable training for attainable endurance goals: intensity distribution for long-term performance development, interval training, periodization and peaking, training monitoring to support the process, and Q&A time. To register for this live stream, jump over to pogophysio.com.au/Dr. Seiler, and from just $49, you can learn from one of the world's most preeminent sports scientists around all things endurance training. The ticketed price includes post-live stream recording, a workbook, and of course, live Q&A time with Dr. Seiler himself.
Hi, it's Chris Bramah. I'm a physio from the Manchester Institute of Health and Performance and biomechanics researcher from the University of Salford. You are listening to this expert edition of the Physical Performance Show, exploring all things biomechanics of the running athlete.
And the winner is...
Failure is not an option.
I've had my ups and my downs.
I think it's an absolutely breakthrough experience.
Welcome to the Physical Performance Show, the show designed to inspire the pursuit of your physical best performance. I'm your host, Brad Beer. Listen in as we delve into how the world's top physical performers achieve their success, as well as the highs, the lows, and the journey of getting there. Let's get ready, set, let's go. Welcome to the Physical Performance Show, brought to you by Pogo Physio's telehealth consultations and our upcoming Dr. Stephen Seiler live stream event, Sustainable Training for Attainable Endurance Goals. I'm Brad Beer, sports physiotherapist and exercise scientist by trade and training, and founder of Pogo Physio. Each week, we'll aim to bring you the latest and greatest inspiration and information designed to help you perform at your physical best. We do this across a range of different episodes, interest editions, coaches' corners, featured performers, and expert editions. And on today's episode 223, I share with you a conversation I had recently with UK-based physiotherapist and running researcher Chris Bramah. And on this expert edition, we'll explore all things the biomechanics of the running athlete. By way of bio, Chris is a UK-based and has worked with and provided services for British Athletics and Team GB. Chris is completing a PhD investigating the biomechanics of running-related injuries and biomechanical differences between elite and recreational runners. Chris has published many peer-reviewed articles, and in addition to his consultancy and research-based work, also provides gait analysis services to runners of all levels through his clinic at the University of Salford Manchester. And if you've ever wondered just how important running technique is, then this is a conversation you are not going to want to miss. In today's conversation, Chris shares around just what role running biomechanics, or the way we move, our running technique if you like, play when it comes to injury prevention, treatment, rehabilitation, and our running performance. Chris will share around the top biomechanical factors that Chris's research and others have shown to be linked to running injury, the role of specific biomechanics related to common running injuries such as IT band pain, tibial bone stress injuries, and Achilles tendinopathy. And Chris explores the commonly asked question around foot strike landing. Does it matter or does it not? There is so much in this expert edition. Get ready with your pen and paper. Here is my conversation with Chris Bramah, UK-based physiotherapist and running gait researcher on all things biomechanics of the running athlete. Chris Bramah, this is a real professional treat for myself, and I'm excited for the Physical Performance Show listeners who I know we theme this show, the highs, lows, and learn-ins, and they are in for some great learn-ins from yourself. So welcome to the Physical Performance Show.
Thank you for having me, Brad. It is a pleasure to finally be on here alongside some fantastic people who I've listened to on this show for quite a while.
Well, Chris, you're a fellow physiotherapist, you're a clinician, and you're also an avid researcher undergoing your PhD there at the University of Salford, Manchester, United Kingdom. And there is a lot to your professional career. So perhaps to paint a bit of context to just the vast experiences and the knowledge base you bring on the topic of today, which is the biomechanics of the running athlete. Can you put us in a little bit of a perspective around your professional life?
Yeah, so this one's a big one, bringing you up to speed with the crazy world that I try and cope with on a daily basis. So as you said, I'm a physio by background. And also my academic career is focusing pretty much on running biomechanics. From a physiotherapy point of view, I run my own physio business called Extra Mile Health, and I am based out of the Manchester Institute of Health and Performance. Alongside working with runners and predominantly treating people from recreational level right up to elite, I have also worked with Team GB and British Athletics since 2013, I think now, and do continue to do so. And that's been quite a great opportunity for me, really, because it's given me a chance to work with some amazing endurance athletes, but also some amazing coaches and clinicians that have helped to feed into the work that I do on an academic basis in terms of trying to understand the way we move and how that impacts injury and performance. So I guess the academic and clinical side ties in because what we've done over the last 7 years is take the academic complex biomechanics assessment measures, so 3D gait analysis is what we do, and not only just offer this out for research, but we now offer it on a clinical basis. So we use these complex systems to try and give people an input into their lives, into their running, to try and help them with either injuries or performance and things like that. So there's a huge complexity into what we do, but generally all feeds into one another.
And, you mentioned the two branches there, Chris, the impact on injury and the impact on performance. And I think you can't separate the two in many ways, can you? If you're talking to a runner or an athlete about trying to decrease the likelihood of injury, then you're also, on the other hand, likely talking about potential performance gains.
Yeah, that's always one that I do say to people is that, if you want to perform at your best, you're going to have to redline. And as a result of that, you're going to walk this fine tightrope, which is always between performing optimally and getting injured. At the same time, if you want to live your life and never get injured, I've got the most simple solution for all of you, and it's stop running.
Yeah.
But it doesn't really work, does it? So, I think if we want to perform at our best, the two of them are going to walk hand in hand, and we have to be prepared that, optimal performance is going to also come at a great cost if we get it wrong.
Yeah, gosh. Well, Chris, we want to go there today and draw from some of your knowledge. But just on your PhD, I think it's worth highlighting the theme for your PhD. My understanding is you're investigating the biomechanics, which we'll give the definition of biomechanics in a moment, of running-related injuries and the differences between elite and recreational runners. What would you add to that, and where are you up to with this PhD process?
Yeah, so the PhD is nearing completion now, so hopefully in the next few months that should be out of my life, because that's been one big burden I've been carrying for quite a while. But briefly summarising the background of it, is my thesis as a whole focuses really on injury and what are the biomechanics that contribute to running-related injuries, what we can do about that, and whether or not we can intervene to change biomechanics and improve injury outcomes. But at the same time, through developing these services, we've, and also being a clinician and a runner, I've always been really interested in multiple different aspects, and I tend to go off on tangents. So the performance aspect has been another really interesting area that we've wanted to look at as a research group. So we have started to try and we have quite a few publications out at the moment that try to look at what the difference is between high performance runners and recreational runners.
You mentioned there, can we intervene? Let's draw from some of your learnings thus far. I know it's not a finalised process, but I'm sure we can glean from some of this this burden that you've been carrying for our benefit.
Yeah, so if that question, can we intervene? So my opinion is yes, we can intervene. I think, and you've got to take into consideration that I may have some bias in this, in my judgment. But from weighing up the literature and from looking at my anecdotal experience with injured runners and those who are looking to try and improve performance, yes, we can intervene, and there are aspects of biomechanics that we can improve that will give both recovery from symptoms and also allow us to enhance performance. So yeah, that's the short answer to a very long topic.
A very long topic that's taken you many years, 3.5 years or thereabouts, I suspect, to get on the cusp of publishing, plus the prior years. And so we'll talk about this, and obviously we can intervene, or we wouldn't be diving deep on this as an expert edition. Chris, let's go back to basics. Biomechanics. I think many recreational athletes know the term. They feel like they've got a handle on it, and even clinicians, but it's easy to kind of get a bit muddled in our own interpretation of what it actually is. So what are biomechanics, Chris?
The science of biomechanics, or the study of biomechanics, is really looking at human function and how human tissues function. And specifically when we talk about running biomechanics, what we're looking at is the way the forces act upon the body, the movements that occur, and how the tissues of the body respond to those movements and forces. And that really encompasses everything from down to joint level, to ligaments, to tendons, to muscles, is really about how they function and cope with these applied forces and movements. So, we then look at all of that and try and use this information to understand the performance consequences and the injury consequences of those movement patterns and the stresses we encounter.
So performance consequences and injury consequences, these are flow-on effects from the biomechanics of the runner. And 3 words kind of jumped out there, Chris: tissues, forces, and movements.
Yeah. In
simple terms.
Yeah, so tissues, when we use that term, really what we're talking about are any of the parts of our body or the structures of our body. So that can be like our muscles, it can be down to like our tendons, or even our bones. So it's any like human structure. And the forces are, every time, gravity keeps us attached to the ground. So every time we move, it is a result of how we interact with the gravitational pull of the world around us, and that will apply a force to the body. And as a result, these forces are going to have consequences for how our tissues must behave, or our structures must behave to cope with them. So it's looking at, that consequence can be something from, I need to contract my calf a lot harder to raise myself up onto my toes. So the contraction of the tissue will create a force into the ground, which allows me to raise up. And also the movements that will occur. So if I lean forward, the force is going to want to pull me forwards into a stride. Therefore, as a consequence, you'll break into a run. So really all of these are components of biomechanics, and they all interact to dictate how we function and how we behave.
What could the recreational athlete appreciate about forces and force generation as runners that you think is probably overlooked?
I definitely think what we underestimate and what a lot of runners don't appreciate is how much force we have to deal with when we run. So, if you go out for just a steady state jog, every time you hit the ground, your body is exposed to a really high level of force. And these impact forces range from like 1.5 times your body weight up to 3 times your body weight, depending on the speed that you run at and the height that you bounce. And I think this is a really underappreciated point for many of us as recreational runners, because we simply think, okay, well, it's COVID-19, I'm stuck in my house and I've not got a job to go to anymore, so I'm going to take up a lot more running. And what they don't realize is actually every time they set foot on the ground, that their body is having to cope with 2 times their own body weight of force. And that can take a real physical toll on us as a whole. And, as a result, it can rapidly increase the risk of injury. Combined with the fact that you think of, for every minute of running, we probably take an average of 170 steps. So if you then go out to run a 30-minute run, or to even think, I'm going to take up a half marathon or a marathon, the number of steps and therefore the number of times we're exposed to these really high forces is all of a sudden going from 170 times in that minute to thousands and thousands and thousands. So, this is something that we don't appreciate, is that even adding just 1 minute onto the end of our run adds a significant amount of impact into our body.
Yeah, so interesting. And the 1.5 to 3 times body weight, depending on speed, and on average, say 2 times body weight. You're referring there, Chris, to ground reaction force?
Yeah. So we call it the ground reaction force. So basically, for any, one of Newton's laws is for every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction. So, every time you hit the ground, there's a force that is going to be applied back to your body. And that's going to be dictated, primarily from like how high you are bouncing from. So if you run faster, you'll probably bounce higher, or how hard you put your foot into the ground will also influence the force that's going to react back at you.
So the height that you are landing from, essentially, which is determined largely by the speed you're running at, is going to dictate the body weight multiples of ground reaction force.
Yeah, so obviously your body weight is going to have an influence. The height that you bounce from. So if you if you jump up and down on the spot, every time you hit the ground, there's a significantly higher amount of force that's going to come back at you. But not only that, but also it's like how hard you physically want to drive your limb into the ground. So, the two of us can stand here right now. You can raise your knee up into the air. And if you swing your leg really hard and fast down into the ground and hit that floor, that mass of that leg is being driven into that ground really fast. And as a result, there's going to be an equal reaction back from the ground. So it's really influenced by how hard we choose to hit the floor, which can be influenced by the speed we run at, the muscle forces that we're having to generate to push, or the height that we bounce along from. So there's quite a few different factors that influence it, but effectively it's all about how we collide with the ground.
How we collide with the ground. And Chris, there was some work that, came out early 2019 from Zellick and fellow authors around the ground reaction force metrics not necessarily being directly correlated with internal tissue loads,
yep,
such as what they looked at through the shin. So I was, as a clinician, and sort of making sure that I'm not getting too deep here on the technicalities, but my takeaway was that the ground reaction forces maybe, as you mentioned, but the internal tissue loads may be a whole lot higher. They cited 6 to 14 times body weight from memory at, for example, the shin bone, the tibia.
Yeah, the whole concept of the forces that are applied to the body go vastly beyond like us just colliding into the ground. It is also how our muscles will contract to deal with them forces and in response to them forces. So their work in particular was talking more about bone stress and whether or not the external forces of us colliding with the ground explained all of what the stress that was applied to the bone. So what you have to appreciate is that also your muscles are attached to those bone structures as well. So not only is it going to be like how hard we hit the ground, but if that muscle contracts, that is also introducing another force, like another compressive force or bending force, that is again going to be applied to that structure in that bone. So, yeah, the forces from the ground reaction forces and externally as we hit the ground are an important factor, but these are also going to vary throughout the whole body. So some tissues are going to, these forces are going to be magnified a significant amount than others. And a really nice example is if you look at like muscle loads, for example, but based on the contraction of muscles as well as the ground reaction force components, you can see that different muscles are exposed to really different rates. So like your soleus muscle, for example, that's your big calf, that can experience forces of up to 7 times body weight, whereas your hamstring muscles are significantly lower when we run at a slow pace. They may only encounter forces of around 1 times body weight for a slow pace running. So, really the forces that we're exposed to are going to vary throughout the whole musculoskeletal system.
And the takeaway there for the recreational endurance athlete is just to appreciate that what, Chris, we need to be strong and robust as runners to deal with these forces, and we need to try and make wise training decisions.
Yeah, I think you hit the nail on the head with those takeaway points, that really, you've got to appreciate the magnitude of the forces that are acting on the body and how these are incredibly high and are going to differ throughout different structures. So you've got to then respect the training that you're doing. You can't just go from 0 to hero. You can't all of a sudden go from running 10 miles a week to 60 miles per week and expect your body to be able to cope with that increase in total force application. And at the same time, if we are not conditioned to run in the first place, that we are placing ourselves at a considerable risk of developing future injury going forward. So, it's not only is it important to think of like the way we run and how the biomechanics influence the stress that's applied to our body, but we've got to think about whether or not we have the ability, or what we sometimes as clinicians will call the capacity, to tolerate those applied loads. A nice phrase that someone once told me is like, don't necessarily use running as a form of conditioning. You've also got to make sure you're conditioned to run.
Be conditioned to run. And if we just follow that thread here, Chris, a little deeper, being conditioned to run can involve what, Chris, from your perspective?
For me, being conditioned to run is about gradually building up your both your cardiovascular ability and the strength of your individual tissues throughout the body. So that can really take the form of starting with even just getting out walking. So building up your tissues ability to withstand walking, turning that into like jog walks, so you can develop your ability to tolerate low level jogging. But even getting into the gym and just lifting weights, so we can start to condition the specific muscles to cope with or to try and cope with the forces that we're going to start to encounter when we get out there to run.
And then in the gym, we talking about, Chris, from your perspective, and I know it's difficult to sometimes generalize to just the principle when this is so individual, but would you endorse isolated muscle group work to try and optimize the capacity or the ability of each of the muscles in the running body, or some compound exercise, or anything's better than nothing?
In general terms, I like compound exercises because these are the types of exercises where really we can start to create high amounts of force and put a high amount of stress through the body. So things like your squats, your deadlifts, you can really start to lift some good amount of force, put stress throughout the whole system, so it's starting to condition them tissues to run. But you can't shy away from the fact that isolated muscle strengthening is also going to have a benefit going forward into your ability to cope with running. So an example being isolated calf strength. Like, as we touched on before, your calves are going to be exposed to a considerable amount of force when we run. So isolated conditioning of those muscle groups will hopefully give those structures their ability to tolerate those forces that we experience when we go out there running. So for me, my simple ones, if I was to go, here's a generic conditioning program that I like people to do, is I love people to be able to squat. I love them to be able to do a deadlift. And then I generally throw in there some like leg extensions for quad work, some calf raises for the calf conditioning. And then maybe even like some hip abductor or glute work. I think those are as a simple program, start to give base level tissue qualities around the structures that are going to be used the most and exposed to the highest amount of loads when we run.
Ideally, it can be achieved in a gym setting with external loads that can, push a runner. But would you still also suggest if a runner just can't access a gym, we're recording through the COVID period, that there's still a lot that can be achieved and gained through home exercise routines?
I do really like the high load type exercises, so being able to lift heavy weights, because as we touched on how much force we're exposed to, I think it's really key for us to lift against high resistance. But for those people who are stuck indoors and can't, I still think we can just condition the tissues slightly different. So my approach to that would be I'd just switch to really high volume type exercises with low recovery, and just try and get almost a cardiovascular or a metabolic stress on individual muscle groups, because it still will give them some tissue gains and it will promote the tissue qualities that you need to be out running. But in an ideal world, I do think resistance in the gym is a big one for me.
And just to dig a little deeper on the home stuff, any top exercises from Chris's desk there for home, those stuck at home?
Again, I would go with your bodyweight squats. Let's go single leg squats, step ups. I love a high step up because that gives you control around the hip. Also gets you used to applying force into the ground. And I can't, not recommend the use of calf raises. Probably going to hit home a lot on the fact that calves are really important. So calf raises on the edge of your stairs. You want to get some resistance on there. Start stacking up some rucksacks with bottles of water in. That can be really beneficial as well. But those for me, I'd go squats, calf raises, and single leg step up, single leg squats.
And you mentioned that, to make up for not being able to add a lot of external load, you may look to stress the system through lots of reps, high reps.
Yeah, so if you can't add the load on, just more reps, short recovery, really work on trying to fatigue that muscle, get a nice metabolic stress on that muscle, work it to its maximum capacity and force it to adapt. I mean, you don't get better at doing something and you don't get better at coping with pressure unless you put yourself under physical pressure. So you've got to find a way to push your body to what it can achieve if you want it to adapt. Yeah. But at the same time, if you do live with other people, you could always utilize their assistance for some additional weight. You could seated calf raises with someone sat on your knee is a nice option for those people who want to get some soleus conditioning in.
There's been some great bear hug squats going on around the world through COVID. I've noted on social media.
yeah, definitely get involved in that.
Get creative. Chris, thanks for going down that path. So we've explored what biomechanics are and some of the key considerations around that, the tissues, the forces, the movements. If we look specifically at injury causation, and you released a paper with your colleagues in 2018, scientific paper, is there a pathological gait associated with common soft tissue running injuries? It got a lot of shares and likes, etc., on social media, as you'd expect. But that might be a nice little place to start. What did you find with that paper, and in simple terms?
Okay. The aim of the paper, I mean, the title was a bit controversial, and some people seem to pick up on that. But the aim of that paper really was to try and identify whether or not there are similar running mechanics that can contribute to multiple different types of injury. So, if we look on injury by injury, you could probably start to formulate a picture where there are lots of these subtle and little things that may contribute to an injury. And that can be very complicated and become incredibly complex for any clinician, let alone a runner, to understand. So really with this paper, it was trying to ask, look, are there similar biomechanics that contribute to injury throughout the whole lower limb? And the way we tried to do this was we took a load of runners with different types of injury and we compared their mechanics to a healthy group. And then what we did was, once we found certain patterns, we started to look at, okay, well, if we break up those individual injuries, do we still see the same patterns in them injuries? And there were a couple of different biomechanical patterns that seemed to be clearly present amongst multiple different injuries. So these were your Achilles injuries, your runner's knee, your shin splints or medial tibial stress syndrome. They all had similar patterns. And the specific patterns that we saw were that these injured runners weren't able to maintain their pelvis control. So if you imagine your pelvis as put your hands on your hips, this is a shelving unit now, and then you tip that shelving unit to one side away from the standing leg. That's what we call pelvic drop, or hip dip, as other people have called it. Now that seemed to be observed amongst all of these different runners. And so did some patterns that were characteristic of an overstride running. So you landing on a really outstretched leg with the ankle really high, inclined into the air. So just reaching too far in front of them. So what we think with these patterns is that, the whole body is linked as a big chain. So what you do at one area will impart stress on another. And what we proposed with the paper was that this possibility that these biomechanics may be influencing stress throughout the whole body, which might be contributing to the injuries that they are experiencing.
And those injuries that your paper looked at are, very common. They're the top running injuries: kneecap pain, patellofemoral pain, shin splints, as you mentioned, Achilles tendinopathy or Achilles tendon injuries, and ITB band pain, or ITB syndrome as it's so commonly referred to. So the takeaway there is the pelvic drop can influence or was noted to be present, and as was overstriding, if you like. And just a lot of people have thoughts around overstriding. What's your simple definition of an overstride, Chris?
So for me, an overstride is when the foot is placed too far ahead of the body. So when you contact the ground, it's outstretched in front of you, the knee is locked into extension, and the toes are raised really high into the air. That, for me, is a simple definition of overstride, is those people, so it gives them this characteristic of they're reaching too far in front of them as they run.
And these two observed and measured features, if you like, of a running gait were correlated with these running injuries. You mentioned something there, that the whole body is linked. It's a big chain, and I think it's easy to fall into the trap of believing that manipulating the way we run can eliminate forces, but or have them disappear magically. But the reality is that we're just shifting forces from one area to another. Correct?
Yeah, I think you've touched on quite a few different points there that are quite key messages. And the first one is this, and a trap that clinicians fall into is this assumption that biomechanics cause injury full stop, and that if you don't run well, you get injured. But it is not that straightforward. These biomechanics are associated with different types of injuries. Just because you have certain biomechanical patterns that are associated with injury doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to go out there and you're going to get injured. It has to be put into the context of that individual person. So clinically, we tend to break injury causation down into really simple terms, and put it into those simple terms. It's a balance between the stress or the load that we apply to the body, and how frequently we apply that load to the body, and our ability to tolerate the loads that we apply. So these biomechanics are one aspect of that influence the load that is applied to the body. So what we are saying is that when you run, the whole body's linked. If you have these biomechanics, the loads might be a bit greater for that person per stride. Now, this, if you have the structural tolerance, which goes back to your strength and conditioning, if your structures can cope with that load, then you're not going to get injured. But also similarly, if you don't expose yourself to much running and you don't do much running, again, it doesn't matter if you have poor biomechanics, because that stress that's applied to the body might be applied only very infrequently. So again, you might not get injured. Now, the analogy I like to use in presentations on this sort of topic is for anyone you've watched Friends, the TV series?
Yep. I have to admit, and I've never watched an episode from start to finish, but I've seen snippets of it over the years.
So one of the most bandied about thing on there, or talked about, people always know Phoebe from Friends and how Phoebe runs. And because she runs horrendously, and she's basically mocking when she does the run. But my point on this is Phoebe has poor biomechanics. Why can Phoebe function with these biomechanics and not get injured? And it's there was 10 series of Friends, and I only saw her run in one episode. So the likelihood is, despite having these awful biomechanics, she just didn't do enough to get injured. So that's my analogy that I use for people, is that it doesn't matter if you have these biomechanics. It's in the context of what you want to do. So if you only run infrequently, that is fine. And at the same time, it's we don't necessarily need to change it. We might be able to build the tolerance in your tissues to cope with those stresses that are going to be applied to the body.
And the takeaway to the common listener of this show isn't likely to want to be Phoebe, running once out of 10 episodes. They are wanting to increase their frequency and their workloads over time. So the key consideration there, Chris, would be what? for that runner?
Well, if they want to run, well, okay. So you have to acknowledge that then the stress might be a bit greater for that person. So you've got to take more of a cautious approach to how you increase your training volume. So, that's when things like the 10% rule in weekly volume might be more applicable to that person. It's like, be cautious in how you expose yourself to the impacts of running. And at the same time, you could take other additional steps to mitigate this risk. So you could get into the gym and, work with a conditioning coach or with a physio to try and improve your ability of your tissues to withstand the stresses that are applied to the body. And then, on that same argument, we have a final option, which is a consideration for people, which is whether or not you want to change the way that you run or adjust the way that you run. And that, again, is opening up a debate of, like, we've got to weigh up these risks that are involved in changing the way people move.
So there's risks associated with changing the way people move, specifically how people run. Let's definitely go there, Chris, because I think it'll be an interesting topic to explore. But just reversing for a moment, is there anything you'd add to the concept that when we do look to intervene, potentially to help someone change how they run, that what's happening to the forces there, in that they're not necessarily being eliminated, they are just being shifted?
Yeah, so when we change the way someone moves, we don't necessarily get rid of those stresses. Usually what we're doing is we're shifting the stress from one tissue to another. So the classic example is, if you run on your heel, the stress is usually greater around the quadricep muscles and the knee joint. And in order to reduce that stress on the knee and on the quads, what we can do is get you to run on the ball of your foot or on your toes. But all we're doing there really is we're shifting the forces away from the knee down to the calf. So it's the analogy of you're robbing Peter to pay Paul, which is basically you're taking away from one and you're going to give it to the other. You're not getting rid of the risk or the stress. You're just moving it to a different structure that may be equally as vulnerable to injury, and that's part of the decisions that you've got to make. The
decisions that you have to make if you're a health practitioner trying to assist a runner either recover from an injury or prevent an injury, reduce injury risk, and then also the decision you need to make as an athlete around, do I need to consider whether I need to manipulate how I run? And I think it sounds so simple in concept, yet the years I've spent around working with runners and endurance athletes, sometimes the more I think about it, the more confusing it can seem.
Yeah, so I get that it can be confusing. I like to try and approach it in a very simplistic manner, in a sequential manner. So when I look at the way somebody would run, first of all, they present to you and they present with a clinical problem or a performance problem. So you might come into me and say, I'm injured, I want to improve my injury and get rid of this pain. Or you might come in and say, look, I want to enhance my performance. And then from that, and you've got your goal of what you're trying to achieve, then we'd like to look at the way a certain person runs. And now this is where clinicians tend to fall down, and even runners can tend to fall down, is that we sometimes try to fit the biomechanics into the problem. It's like I'll see people come to me and they expect me to give them a biomechanical solution to whatever task that they are bringing me. But the real key for us to keep remembering as clinicians, coach and runners here is when we look at those movement patterns, you've got to ask yourself, are these mechanics explaining the performance problem or the injury? And for me, really, it's got to be blatantly obvious. If you to be like, okay, yeah, we've definitely got a link here between your mechanics clearly explain that type of injury, or yeah, your mechanics are clearly explaining the performance reduction. And if they are, then you can start to say, okay, well, what are the steps we can do to change those mechanics? In considering them steps, you have to say, okay, where are the benefits and the risks here? And are they worth taking?
Wow, that's brilliant. There's a lot there. I'm just going to recap, Chris. You've got to consider the goal. Is it a clinical problem? So to be specific, that could be a pathology or an injury of some sort, right? A runner with a sore shin, a runner with some IT band issues, a runner with a sore knee. Performance problem might specifically be what, Chris? What might be an example of a performance problem?
So sometimes I've had people come into our clinic and they just turn around to me and say, oh yeah, I'd like you to look at my gait because I want to run faster or want to be more economical in the way that I run. And, this one, again, is like you've got to really put it into that context, because I like to sit down with people and go, okay, well, what are you doing from a training perspective? What are you doing from a nutrition perspective? And weigh up all these other these factors as well, because biomechanics can have some impact upon performance, but we're probably talking marginal gains here. I think you've got to get the big percentages right first. There's no use in working on the marginal gains if you only run twice a week and you want me to correct your biomechanics and think that's going to make your performance better. It's trying to really keep it into that picture. But yeah, sometimes people think, can improving my mechanics make me a better runner?
I think that's a really great and important point, Chris, is to consider the other factors. And it's no different to the over-attribution that, we've all probably fallen into throughout our recreational / sporting pursuits. For example, a pair of shoes. Well, this has to be the next, the solution or my key to getting faster. So it's keeping the perspective, and when we stop and think about it, it's quite humorous to think that we can place so much value on something, yet there's big factors and influences that we haven't fully developed or given attention to.
Yeah, I think it is really important to I always say to people, fix the obvious, or is it obvious?
Fix the obvious.
It's like there's no point in trying to correct something or change something that's not blatantly obvious as a problem. And, when it comes down to performance for running, it's a massive big, there's so many different influences there. There's your genetics that influence it. The training that you do really has an impact and an influence. Your nutrition will have a big influence. The environment that you're in, not just things like the shoes and the mechanics. Granted, I think, these are all like 1%ers that, can also interact with one another. So one of my big take homes for people is like, if the mechanics are causing someone to repeatedly get injured, they're not going to be able to attain the training that they need to do to perform. So in that instance, that might be more your obvious, like, yeah, actually, if you correct your mechanics, you will become a better runner, because actually you might be able to do the training that you repeatedly break down trying to do.
And an example of that, Chris, might be what?
So say, for example, if we go back to some of these parameters, so if we say somebody's got an overstride, or the hip cuts in across the body too much, we sometimes call it hip adduction. Now, these are linked to injury development. And I know a lot of people will say, or currently try and argue with, out there, that these parameters don't really matter. But, some of our data in one of my PhD chapters and topics was looking at how these mechanics appear amongst those people who do different training volumes. So effectively, what we find is that those people who can stay injury-free and tolerate really high training volumes, they tend not to demonstrate these biomechanical patterns. So it really raises the question of like, okay, well, why are these high mileage people, why have they not got these biomechanical patterns? And for me, it's one of two things. It's either you get injured and you can't tolerate the high training volumes, and in that case, we might want to correct that at baseline. Or if we're gradual and slowly progress the training that we're doing, maybe we adapt our biomechanics to become more biomechanically efficient. But either way, the take home there is the biomechanics are clearly abnormal biomechanics and clearly not seen in high mileage runners. So if you want to attain that really high training load that's going to give you the performance gains, and every time you try, you keep breaking down, you clearly not adapting to that training load, and it might be something we can look at.
And some of those abnormal biomechanics that aren't seen in high mileage runners, which every runner really aspires to be, because, volume and training loads create the adaptation to help boost performance. Things like you've mentioned, Chris, just to really drive home the learnings, the leg coming across the midline, adduction, a bit of an overstriding, and then hip drop or contralateral pelvic drop. That'd be, three of the big ones?
Yeah, I'd say those are your real big ones that we know from the literature are commonly raised as associated with sort of injury developments. There are other things that people talk about out there. There's a lot of, people sometimes try and suggest foot pronation, and that becomes like a real focus in shoe shops, is that, if your foot's pronating, you're going to get injured. But actually, from the scientific evidence, that, foot pronation and its link to running-related injuries is very weak at best, and often it isn't. So, really, I'd say those things are more myths. The ones that I'd look at are the ones you mentioned.
And I guess it's a good place to just explore your teachings and your learnings around foot positioning at foot strike. So much, I know you've already referenced running on the heel versus running on the ball of the foot and how that influences things further up the running body in terms of muscle forces and loads. But what takeaways do you think are important for the listener of this show to appreciate about the importance or otherwise of foot strike?
Yeah, so foot strike is a really great topic. So, people fit into two camps out there. Well, not necessarily two camps, but there are two strong polarized camps. Those people who say we should all be running like forefoot, and those people who say that, it doesn't matter. And the reality is your foot strike and whether or not that links to injury really doesn't matter. So running on your heels isn't wrong, and running on your forefoot isn't wrong. What happens is that these two extremes of a movement pattern, they influence the stress on the body in completely different ways. So if you land on your heel, you've probably got more stress that's going through the knee and the quadriceps. And if you land on your toes, you've got more stress that's going through your calf and your Achilles complex in your foot. Now, those stresses themselves don't necessarily get you injured, and are not going to explain why everybody gets these different types of injuries. Really, we should be able to adapt our tissues to respond to running on your heel or running on your toes. And I think the biggest injury risk actually comes from these beliefs that one foot strike is a right way to run. Because when people fall into this camp that they believe that running on your forefoot is going to solve the world of all its running-related injury problems, and they try and convince all of these people to switch from landing on their heels to their toes, it shifts the loads completely. So you go from having relatively low stress at your calf to masses of stress on your calf. And in a large proportion of cases, that is the thing that gets you injured, is the changing of the foot strike pattern. But fundamentally, this whole concept of one foot strike being correct over the other is based on very weak evidence, and it's almost non-existent, this evidence. It is essentially it's a bias that's formed by some people to believe that one foot strike is better than the other.
So, sorry, Chris, the evidence is weak. The biases can be strong, and something I find myself clinically often educating runners around is don't try and manipulate your foot in any way. Let it do its thing. Is that sound advice, Chris?
Yeah. I don't believe in trying to change the position that people land on the foot, or change the angle of the foot. I think more of the key things are just getting the foot close to your center of mass. So whether or not that is on your toes or it's on your heel, just let it do what it naturally wants to do in that respect, because it will have adapted from years and years to develop the structural integrity to cope with that way of running. And you simply changing that is almost asking what your body's naturally adapted to do from birth to do something completely different. For me, all of a sudden asking it to do something completely different in my 30s. I've got a lot of unraveling to do there.
Chris, I'm on the eve of looking at my fourth decade, so I've got more unraveling to do. Chris, let it do what it wants to do, the foot. I think that's a nice little takeaway right there. And just on the foot, you often hear people say the foot's got to land under the center of mass, but can you speak to the truth or otherwise in that verse, the foot landing slightly in front, and what happens with different running speeds?
So it's impossible to land with your foot directly underneath your center of mass. So, you could do that, but what's then going to happen is you're probably going to fall over. So when when you land and you put your foot out in front of you, you need it to be slightly ahead of your center of mass, and it will naturally form slightly ahead of your center of mass. And as a result of that, it will give you this brief, what we call braking phase. And during that braking phase, you're effectively storing all of the energy as you slow yourself into the ground within your tissues that you can hopefully then return in the second half of stance as you push off for the next stride. And the problem is, if you put your foot too far ahead of your center of mass, you give yourself a lot of energy to absorb and a big braking period. But if you put your foot directly underneath your center of mass or behind your center of mass, then your mass is going to keep falling forwards. So I think you can try this when you go out to walk, is like keep putting your foot behind you as you land. You can't do it. You're just going to fall flat on your face. So you need to have it at some point in front of your mass so you can absorb some force to later return into your next stride. But if you have it too far in front of you, then you give yourself a lot of time for braking, which is obviously going to increase the risk of injury, but also it's going to become like not very cost effective. So it's going to start to slow your performance down, or make your economy a bit reduced.
You're listening to UK-based physiotherapist and running gait researcher Chris Bramah on this, an expert edition of the Physical Performance Show. Support for today's show comes from Pogo Physio's upcoming live stream event featuring acclaimed sports scientist, forefather of the polarised training approach, Dr. Stephen Seiler. On the 18th of July, Dr. Seiler will present his 3-hour live stream event, Sustainable Training for Attainable Endurance Goals. 4 topics will be explored: intensity distribution, interval training, periodization, and monitoring. Dr. Seiler is an acclaimed sports scientist, viral TED Talk presenter, and a dual guest of the Physical Performance Show. Tickets are available from just $49 and include a post-live stream event recording, workbook, and access to Dr. Seiler for live Q&A during the session. Jump over to pogophysio.com.au/Dr. Seiler live stream. Support for today's show also comes from Pogo Physio's online telehealth consultations. If you are a runner or endurance athlete frustrated by ongoing injury concerns, then our 45-minute telehealth consultations are an effective way to find a solution. To schedule your 45-minute online consultation with myself or any of the Pogo Physio team, jump over to pogophysio.com.au/telehealth. For now, let's jump back with Chris Bramah on this expert edition on all things biomechanics of the running athlete. Chris, before we jump into a few more really specific looks at, or delving into these specific running-related injuries, just arcing back here to these 3 phases you spoke about in looking at a runner and trying to make a decision around whether to intervene or not. The goal, is it a clinical problem? Is it a performance problem? Looking at how the person runs and remembering that you've got to make a decision around are the mechanics explaining the problem or the pain? And I like to say it's got to jump out and punch me in the face. It's got to punch us in the face. It sounds a bit crass, but if we have to convince ourselves that it's important, then it's probably not.
Yeah, I would fully agree with that. It's like, as Greg Lehman once said to me, he said, if it's not pornographic, it's not a problem. And I would very much adopt those sentiments that, if it's not punching you in the face, if it's not blatantly obvious, I would quickly move on, focus on the things that are likely to be obvious.
And then the next step, if you like, was, what steps to take to change the mechanics, weighing up the risks versus the benefits. So the risks, Chris, would be, as you've already shared, that if a clinician intervened or a runner started to try and manipulate things, they may actually prejudice a heightened risk of injury elsewhere in the running body. Are there any other risks?
Yeah, so what we don't know long term is what changing someone's biomechanics does to their performance. So scientifically, nobody's really followed it up to a great extent of making big gait changes and investigating how that impacts on their performance. So even though we've got this theoretical rationale that we might be able to improve someone's running economy and improve their performance, long term, we don't really know if this is really effective. And actually, in the short term, what we do know is that it can be associated with a greater cost of energy. So what we're playing with here is a risk of potentially worsening someone's performance if they don't adapt or if we don't get it right. And particularly in the short term, that is definitely the case. So you've got your two main risks are, if I change your biomechanics, I could increase the risk of a different type of injury, or I could temporarily or even long term worsen your performance. So that's why when we make that decision, even as runners, we've really got to weigh up, is the risk that's before me worth the potential reward that I can get from this?
And there's no certain way of knowing that. It's based on taking everything into context.
Yeah, I would say your number one thing that we know is going to increase your risk of injury is if you change your foot strike pattern dramatically. Like that is number one, you get a higher risk of injury. And then from the rest of it, it is really weighing up the what's the obvious here, and is this obviously explaining my performance or injury, and therefore is it worth taking the risk? And it's in the context of that person. So if you're working with somebody who's an Olympic finalist and is trying to compete for medals on an Olympic stage, and all of a sudden you decide that changing their running biomechanics is what's going to win them a medal, well, you've just got to bear in mind that, I hope you've got a good explanation for how that's going to win them a medal, because you could very equally make them not make an Olympics full stop or injure them, and their whole career is in your hands. Conversely, you could have somebody who's getting recurrent injuries and is just repeatedly breaking down, and therefore changing their biomechanics does nothing but give them an opportunity to start running and doing the sport that they love healthy again.
Yeah, great examples. Chris, there's a sort of sentiment around don't change what isn't broken. And I guess it ties into this concept of, and the line of thinking around, as runners, don't runners just self-optimize with their biomechanics or how they move? So can you speak to this concept of self-optimizing and, hey, the body's already got it figured out?
Yeah, so this self-optimization theory is building on is this idea that as we expose ourselves to running and as we do more running, that we adapt our biomechanics to a way that's the most economical for us and the most likely to reduce the risk of injury. And I think in some cases this is really true. For some runners, they do that. And I think Izzy Moore did some great work quite a while back now. I think in 2012 she first published that. And what they found, and what she showed within her work, is that you take novice runners and you expose them to some training. And for some of them runners, they start to adapt aspects of their biomechanics that might be making them more economical, and it might also be reducing the risk of injury. But in the same breath, if there's some nice work on looking at people's running cadence, and actually what that work shows, that asks the question of, do we optimize our cadence to one that's most economical for us? And what it showed is that between every person, there was a large variability in those people who did find the way that was the most economical for them, and for those people who were just completely way off the mark. So the answer to, do we adapt aspects of our biomechanics to make us more efficient, is really a two-sided coin of some people do, some people don't. And in those people who don't, maybe helping to facilitate that learning of those movement patterns may help them to become more economical and reduce the risks associated with injury.
Oh, that's great. Chris, can you share some practical examples of how you may help a runner to address some of those movement patterns or biomechanical concerns, maybe starting with, say, a runner with kneecap pain and cadence? What might you have a runner do around their cadence?
Changing biomechanics, there's different ways. We've got the evidence-based, nice, simple approach, and then there's this more complex approach to improving someone's biomechanics, which is a bit of a layered approach. But if we start with what we know from scientific literature of the evidence-based approach, Now, we mentioned before about the hip and the thigh cutting across the midline, or the knee dropping inwards, or even the pelvis, that hip dip occurring. Now, these biomechanics are linked to injuries like your kneecap pain, or patellofemoral pain is what we call it. And one of the simplest ways for us to target those biomechanics and change them is by asking runners to shorten their stride and increase their cadence. So we do this by either using a metronome. So you can get people you can download freely available metronomes on your phone, and you can program it to play a beat at a set frequency or tempo. And really what you ask these runners to do is try and increase their cadence or their step rate by 10%. And what it's associated with is a change in these mechanical patterns. And in some instances now there is emerging evidence from some case series studies that are showing that if you use this intervention in people with knee pain and who have these biomechanical patterns, it can improve their clinical outcomes, and it can basically reduce the stress that's placed upon the knee, or we're hypothesizing we're reducing the stress, and help to facilitate them get back up and running with less pain.
And why 10% increase in cadence?
Well, really you could go anywhere between 5 and 10%, because these are what have been shown within the literature to give us the biggest improvements in biomechanical patterns. For me, I like the 10% mark, because actually when you ask somebody to increase their cadence and use this metronome, what you find is their ability to do it is just like so vast. So in one of our studies, we gave them a 10% metronome to try and said match your feet to the beat. And whether or not people could actually attain this 10% increase in frequency did vary between people. So some people were going 17% higher than usual. Some people were going 5% higher than usual. So for me, if I set 10%, I know that's going to give us the biggest bang or biggest change for in our mechanics. And also it sort of tries to negate the fact that some people may under-hit the mark or may not get it right if you're asking them for just subtle increases like 5%. But having said that, in increasing it by such a high amount, you do risk making it quite more difficult for their economy or worsening their economy. So people do report that, actually, you know what, I feel really out of breath doing it this way.
And in practically trying to increase the step rate, Chris, you mentioned 10% and using a metronome, a beeper, an app on a phone or a device. What are your thoughts around the reliance on technology such as data from a Garmin and or a manual count of, say, a single leg foot strike on one leg versus trying to count both legs in a minute manually? What are your thoughts on those as potential methods?
So on some of the Garmins and some of the watches, they only give you a beep. If you wanted to use the metronome, they only give you a beep on every second step, which actually is very difficult for the runner to do, because you're then having to think that you've got to get the other leg through, and it places a lot more of a cognitive demand on a person. Now, I think it's so much easier if you have the metronome hitting the beep for every time you're putting your foot down. So I think mobile phone apps become much better for that, and that's why we're using mobile phone apps. But another thing that I don't want is for people to become too reliant upon using technology to guide in everything that they're doing. So the way I try and get people to do it is, if you're making a change, you start early on with integrating it. So, usually within the first 2 weeks, I'd use a bit of a metronome, and I'd monitor like your step rate on your watch. And once you feel like you have got to grips with, okay, yeah, I can get this stride frequency, I can adjust myself accordingly, then start to remove your reliance upon this. And actually what I found is if you get a runner on a treadmill or outdoors, and within the first 5 minutes of teaching them and playing the metronome and getting to grips with this higher cadence, if you take it away, they can keep that feel for quite a while. And then you only occasionally need to reintroduce it. So in effect, what you're trying to do is internalize that feeling of what it's like to run in this different way, and then remember it and practice it without the need for feedback all of the time.
So it's weaning off the need for feedback.
Yeah. You want to gradually wean off that feedback throughout the whole process.
And would you encourage a runner, it can be incredibly intrusive and not very relaxing to have the metronome beeping away at you when you run, let alone someone running with you. What would be your instructions in general terms, Chris, to a runner working on their cadence using a metronome? How often throughout a training run?
So this is really going to be down to how quickly that you pick it up. If you're struggling to pick it up, I'd start by trying on a treadmill. So get on a treadmill, and I'd spend the first 5 minutes listening to the really annoying beep and focusing on trying to get to grips with it and internalizing it, and then removing that metronome immediately and trying to keep the rest of your run going without the use of the metronome. What you can do is, like on your Garmin watches or your Polar watches, they do provide you with feedback on your average cadence throughout the run. So you can then check back and think, okay, was I maintaining that cadence? If you are maintaining the cadence, then the next time you try and run, I'd probably set the metronome, listen to it before you even start to run, so you get the frequency in your mind, and then try and integrate it into the run. Because, a lot of people, as soon as you know what that frequency is you're aiming for, you can internalize it quite well.
So use it to get set for the run, and then you may consider not, needing it for the whole 30-minute run or the 60-minute run.
Yeah, and then just check back with your Garmin data or your Polar data or whatever you're using to see if you actually hit the target that you were aiming for.
And then obviously just monitoring that, as many runners do, with some metrics. You will note if you've slipped back and if you need to maybe pull the metronome out and refresh yourself of the tempo.
Yeah. So if you feel like you're slipping back, then you can reintegrate it. For me, I think having coach input or clinician input is really nice to try and help guide people along that way. Because sometimes we can get bogged down in the data, and I don't want people getting bogged down in the data. The fundamental question is: are you performing? Are you pain free? Are you running?
Yeah. Keep it simple, scientist.
Yeah.
If you missed last week's episode 222, it was another expert edition featuring Australian-based tendon rehabilitation researcher, world-acclaimed Dr. Ebony Rio. There's been a lot of feedback and conversation about Ebony's share-ins, and the learnings were many. Here's a little snippet of my conversation with Ebony Rio.
There are no recipes. By all means, we need to be evidence-based, and the best evidence is for load. There's fantastic research in heavy slow resistance, and I use heavy slow resistance, but I don't do the program that's published because it's double leg. And the people that have tendinopathy have asymmetry. They have absolute muscle wastage, and if we're not giving single leg exercise, then we're really missing an opportunity to address that asymmetry. And that's an issue, because if I'm a runner, running is a series of hops. So I need each leg to be independently strong. And if I'm doing, double leg squats and double leg press and double leg calf raises, then I'm actually allowing my sneaky tendon to hide in the kinetic chain.
If you happen to miss episode 222 and have been dealing or have dealt in the past with a pesky tendon injury, then be sure to jump over and benefit from the many learnings you will receive. For now, let's jump back with this week's expert edition featuring UK-based physiotherapist and running gait researcher Chris Bramah on all things biomechanics of the running athlete.
Chris, touching on pelvic drop, contralateral pelvic drop, hip dip, as you mentioned. How might a runner practically work on that? In my estimation, it's strength and conditioning, trying to condition the muscles around the pelvis to help control. Anything, though, from a movement orientation or cueing that can assist a runner with how to minimise that?
Yeah, so I've played around with this quite a lot over the last few years, is trying to see what different methods we can use to really facilitate a change. Now, the step rate does work, so that one's one option, but the other ways that first of all, I don't think just cueing a runner using internal cues to keep your hips up, I don't think that works very well, and I've not had that work really well. So for me, this is where I start to think, okay, my simple approach would be increase your step rate, but I might move to a more complex, integrated approach by working on a couple of different areas. And these areas are, first of all, ensuring that I have the appropriate strength around my tissues to be able to control my pelvis. So for this, I might look at what's my gluteal strength like, What are my oblique strength like? And is this at an adequate level to suggest that I should be able to control the movement? And then after using that is when I really start to like to bring in specific running drills. Now, I think running drills are very useful because you can break down a movement pattern and start to teach people how to adjust aspects of a more simple movement, i.e. the drill, which hopefully you can then transfer to the task of running later on. So simple approaches for me are, I start with the conditioning, then we go to drills where we look at trying to finish in a elevated pelvis position, or you might call it like some people call it a hip lock, or like a running pose action. So, to give you a visual idea of the end position that I'm looking for, is if you stand on one leg and raise your opposite knee and pop your hands on your hips, the hand that's on the hip with the knee elevated, that side we want higher than the opposite side. And that is the finishing point of a lot of the drills that we then work towards attaining. So we might start really simple and use just like a lunge into a knee drive position and really try and get the runner to focus on finishing and pausing in that position with that pelvis up and that knee up on that opposite side. Then we could put that into a step-up movement, and then we can start to put it into faster running drill-related movements that might be like a leg switch. And so start in that position and quickly switch leg positions and reform and stabilize yourself in that position, to then even integrating that into like a high knee type movement where you pause on alternate high knees and stick that position. So using these types of running drills and focusing on the end movement pattern that you're looking for can hopefully teach these people, or teach whoever you're working with, the end position that you want. And that way they internalize their learning. They learn how to coordinate the muscle movements, and you get better transference to their natural running. And
therefore they're not running along thinking consciously, I need to do this with my pelvis. It's just more automatically happening because it's been transferred from those drills. Yeah. That is exactly what we're after. Is like, I don't want people to have to go away and consciously start thinking of like, oh, is my pelvis set? Is my hips aligned? Is my foot in the right position? Where's my leg stretched out? What's my cadence? This is far too much. I like simple integrated approaches. And I think if, we can teach somebody how to move and to perform a task within a gym-based environment and progressively expose that task out into the running world, then what we're trying to do is first give them their conscious ability to do it, then ensure that it's in their subconscious that they can do it, and then finally just set everybody free and we're running in a better position. Yeah, beautiful. I think that's such an important point, Chris, for people listening in to take away, and that is this shouldn't be an ongoing conscious process. There can be a consciousness required, obviously, at the start, but running shouldn't be a 10-point checklist of what you need to do. Yeah, if you're going out with a checklist and having to think about absolutely everything, then I've done my job wrong, or whoever you're working with has done their job wrong, because that's not what we want. Chris, you're mentioning the high knee finishing drill. Literally took me back to when I was a 15-year-old with both sides some Osgood-Schlatters, which is a common condition for the growing athlete that many people will recognise, and my running coach, thinking very quite forwards thinking, had me not do the normal sessions everyone else was doing on the track, but go out along the back road, and I would go maybe it was a long distance, 500 to 1,000 metres up and back, just doing pausing high knee drills for copious amounts of time. And that was my training whilst I had my downtime. So there was some good merit in that, right? Yeah. I think if we look at the practices of coaches and, and some of the world's best athletes, you can start to learn a lot from the way that they structure their training and the things that they integrate into their training routines. That actually does apply really well to any runner across the board. And I think when I break down them components of what club-based training or good club-based training routines look like and good elite level runners look like, they have similar things in common in terms of they look after their strength and conditioning, so they condition their tissues. They perform
regular running drills, which are all around focusing on optimizing movement patterns, and they expose themselves to a variety of different running stimuluses. So they learn how to run fast up hills, they learn how to run fast on a track, and they learn how to run slow and long. And I think if you have all of these different components, they all feed into one another in terms of how they optimize your biomechanics and allow you to function and complete the training that you want to train. And we may not necessarily have a lot of science there backing up things like these running drills, but the reason we don't have science backing it up is because nobody's done the science to try and back it up.
There's another PhD for Chris Bramah.
I'd rather not.
Leave that for someone else. Chris, on the drills, just to dig momentarily deeper, a recreational runner, competitive recreational runner, how often may they look to do drill work? I know it's so variable, but just in general terms.
So, I think if you have a good frequency of integrating drills, so usually 3 times a week would be like a nice frequency. And if you're only really running about 3 or 4 times a week in general, it might be worth just including them as part of like a warm-up. So a little warm-up practice before you get out to run. And I think that becomes quite useful in that respect. I mean, you start to see a lot of other athletes would use, if they're doing track sessions, it's heavily integrated as part of a warm-up for track sessions. And I know of some coaches who integrate them as sessions, as standalone sessions alone. But for me, it's just making sure you've got the frequency there. So I'd aim for about 3 times per week. And also not go for copious amounts of different drills. Just select 2 or 3 drills that you understand the point of what you're trying to achieve of them. And just practice, do them really well. And once you get them really well, then you can start to integrate other things. The one thing that infuriates me going to watch certain track meets is when people do drills without a purpose. You may as well not do it at all. So take a select few, good frequency, and do them well.
And for the listener out there that's heard you mention a few drills, are there any good resources that you direct people to in terms of drills that maybe don't have access, Chris, to a coach at the club level or in an elite sense?
Yeah, so I think generally if you search around on YouTube, you can find quite a few people who have done some who have got some good drills out there. There's no specific resources. I think somebody really needs to have a search for them. But there are certain sprint-based coaches who have great drills for sprinting that I think really do apply to to endurance running. So you've got Jonas based in Loughborough in London. He's an amazing sprint coach. He's got some great drills there. The same, and I know he puts some on the internet a lot. The same with your Altius Center in Arizona. These are the type of people to probably have a search around for, see what they're doing. And even some other sprint coaches, like I know Lauren Seagrave, he has some amazing little snippets of his knowledge on YouTube that's available for people. And you can take some of those drills, and I think the concepts apply very well to endurance running.
That's powerful and practical as well. It makes me think of observing an Ethiopian track session on a Sunday morning earlier this year in February in Saluta, and Kenanisa's track, and it was quite the spectacle, as I know you've spent time in East Africa, but seeing how the Ethiopians methodically and with discipline perform their drills.
Yeah. That's the thing. You've got to take away the practices from some of the world's best, and think of there's something about those practices that must be helping them to perform. And I think why not try to, one, I think as scientists we should be trying to understand that better, and 2, as runners, it can't really harm to help us. Remember from spending some of my time in Kenya, when you speak to some of the Kenyan athletes and you ask them for the rationale of why they do what they do. So you might see an athlete doing drills, and I remember asking one guy, it's like, oh, why do you do that? And the simple response would be like, oh, well, Kipchoge, he does this all the time, or Mo Farah, I've seen him doing it all the time. So if those guys do it, it must make me good. But I think it's for us as scientists now to try and start backing it up and really understanding why it makes us as good.
Chris, in drawing our discussion towards a close here, what top 3 mistakes would you say runners make regarding biomechanics? Top 3 mistakes.
Top 3 mistakes. So number 1 is obviously bringing us back to the overstride. they slip into lazy patterns and overstride. Number 2 is they think stride length is the most important, and they think that if we need to increase our stride length to go faster. No, we just need to get better at pushing the ground behind us, and that might mean shortening your stride. And then I think that the third conscious mistake that they make is thinking their shoes or changing foot strike pattern is going to save the world. Stick to the shoes that you're the most comfortable in, the ones that you use the most, and accept your foot strike pattern for what it is.
They're so powerful. Be conscious of overstriding, thinking that stride length is the most important thing, and thinking that foot strike pattern changes will save the world. Chris, what are the top 3 mistakes you observe clinicians, physiotherapists, or people working with injured runners make?
The first one is trying to use biomechanics to explain everything. To explain like uninjured runners, to explain injured runners, particularly when it's not obvious. I think that's what I'd call trying to fit a square peg into a round hole. Don't do that, treat the obvious. And then the second one is thinking like low-level strengthening exercises are going to dramatically change someone's biomechanics. Low-level strengthening exercises will not change biomechanics. You need an integrated approach to that. And I would say, and also the final one then is just refusing to acknowledge the host of different factors that can be explaining someone's problem. So not acknowledging training loads, not acknowledging conditioning, not acknowledging psychological stresses and lifestyle factors. Take it in the big picture.
Chris, I'm going to push you here. Thank you for sharing. I'm going to push you here and ask you, as we do every guest, in this case, yourself as an expert edition guest, to dispel everything you've learnt through your professional clinical life, through your own running achievements over the years, through to your scientific work, into one piece of advice to help the listener of the Physical Performance Show perform at their physical best. What is Chris Bramah's one piece of advice going to be?
Oh, be consistent. That's the simplest one. Be consistent in what you do. It's like, don't change too much too soon. Just tick each day off. Be consistently out there trying to get your training sessions done, trying to keep your conditioning done. If you are consistent in what you do, you will reap the rewards of that longer term.
Such beauty in that. Chris, every guest of the show issues listeners with a physical challenge for the week. So what is Chris Bramah's physical challenge going to be?
Do you want this physical challenge in relation to biomechanics, or is this just a global physical challenge?
This can be either, but you've got me intrigued now with the first one, a challenge relating to biomechanics. This is a deep dive into the biomechanics of the running athlete. So how does that relate now to a physical challenge? Chris, I'm intrigued. Okay,
from a physical challenge, I want people to go out there and find 3 drills and practice those 3 drills prior to every single run, and see how that starts to influence their performance. And in particular, ones that I would ask people to go and look for are your classics. See if we can get people to do the dribble series. So if you start searching around for ankle dribbles, let's see how we go with that, and then we'll go for a simple A skip. And let's see if you can do it, 2, how difficult you find it, and 3, how that impacts on your run. Okay, so see if you can add a scissor. I'll give a simple one. Just keep it as a scissor drill.
Scissor drill. So we had the ankle series, the dribble series, I should say, the A skips and the scissor drills.
Yeah, let's see if we can get them into people's routine that wouldn't usually put them in.
Absolutely brilliant. And that is the first for the Physical Performance Show. This is a drill challenge. Chris, if the listener of the show wants to find out more about your professional work, what your output in, engage with your services that do include, you can probably explain this a little more, include video analysis, including online video gait analysis, how can they best go about that?
Yeah, so there's a number of different ways you could probably keep in touch. I think the easiest way that I'd probably respond to is you can contact me via Twitter. My Twitter handle is @ChrisBramah. I generally would have, it's open to direct message me, and my URLs are generally a link to where I'm currently at or more about our services. That's probably your best way. But yeah, you can follow us to see what's going on from an academic standpoint and research-wise, and also have a look at the different services we offer. We do things like running gait analysis from 3D gait analysis to 2D, and I think this COVID-19 thing has forced us to move a bit more online, so we're now offering virtual assessments as well. So yeah, people can follow me and check out what we're up to.
So the listener could send in video footage of them running, captured on a treadmill, and you'd be able to assist from there.
Yeah, so one of the things that we do, because physical contact is pretty difficult in this moment in time, is for those people who want, what we are also doing is having people send us video footage. We give you strict instructions of how to film the different angles that we want. We combine that with a online subjective assessment to sort of establish what your aims are, your ambitions, or your problems. And then we have a look at the way you run and feed that back to you in terms of where you can improve, where you might be going wrong. And, just so you're all aware, if I don't like to fit square pegs into round holes, so if I think your problem is not related to biomechanics, I will very well tell you it's not related to biomechanics.
And there is a great practitioner. And Chris, this is all done through the Manchester Institute of Health and Performance.
Yeah, so we're based at the Manchester Institute of Health and Performance. So, and as I say, I juggle so many different balls. So we've got stuff that's going on at the University of Salford. I've got my own private physio company, Extra Mile Health. So, Twitter's probably the best way to find where all them balls are being held.
Yeah, and we'll tag all that up in the show notes. But Chris Bramah, this wait has been worthwhile in catching up for this expert edition. Thank you for helping us explore the biomechanics of the running athlete on this episode.
Oh, thank you very much for having me, Brad. It's been a pleasure.
So there you have it, another episode of the Physical Performance Show, and I trust you enjoyed and took some learnings from Chris's sharings today. If you did, then reach out and let Chris know. You'll find him active over on Twitter at Chris Bramah, CHRISBRAMAH. If you're needing gait analysis, be sure to check out Chris's services as well. And a massive thank you to Ollie Williamson, UK-based triathlon physio, for connecting Chris and I for today's conversation. A massive thanks to those leaving ratings and reviews over on iTunes. The feedback is always greatly appreciated. Massive thanks also to those hitting subscribe. If you'd like the show, download it to your device each and every week, Thursday evening, as the episodes go live. Then be sure to hit subscribe from whatever platform you enjoy the podcast from. As always, a huge thank you to the great folk who make this show possible. Daryl Misson, our audio engineer, Matthew Olding on all things show graphic design, Susan Wilkin on all things administration, and Lily Burden assisting with social media behind the scenes. Keep the podsies coming. They are always a lot of fun. That's simply a screenshot of the episode that you're enjoying and tagging in the show at Physical Performance Show over on Instagram. We've also got our Facebook page. Simply search the Physical Performance Show. We'd love to see you over there. Now, coming up on the 8th of August, I've teamed up with former expert edition guest of the show, UK-based extended scope physiotherapist Benoit Matthew, to host the first online Masters Athlete Symposium. If you're 35 plus, you are a Masters Athlete, and there are special considerations in looking at optimizing performance for 35 plus year athletes. On the 8th of August, we'll host 15 world-class speakers, including prior featured guests of the Physical Performance Show, Dr. Stacey Sims, Rich Blagrove, Rich Willie, and so many more. Great news, registration is free for this event, and you can register by jumping over to masterathletes.online. Master, M-A-S-T-E-R, athletes, A-T-H-L-E-T-E-S.online. Masterathletes.online. Don't miss out on what will be a terrific day of world-class information. Now, coming up on next week's episode of the Physical Performance Show, we keep the expert edition theme going with an exploration around the intriguing topic of athletic flow. That's right, the flow state. And I'm super excited to share a conversation that I recently had with Rian Doris, the Chief Operating Officer of the Flow Research Collective Institute, founded by best-selling author of The Rise of Superman and world-regarded expert in the field of flow state, Stephen Kotler. So be sure to be tuning in next week to the Physical Performance Show for more highs, lows, and learnings. Until then, Keep pursuing your physical best performance. I'm Brad Beer, and this has been the Physical Performance Show.